Chapter 18 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 18. Seldom did Blair Maynard ever trust himself any more in the presence of his mother's guests. Since Mrs. Maynard had announced the engagement of his sister Margaret to Richard Swan, she had changed remarkably. Blair did not love her any the better for the change. All his life, as long as he could remember, he and Margaret had hated pretension and the littleness of living beyond their means. But now, with this one coup d'etat, his mother had regained her position as the leader of Middleville society. Haughty, proud, forever absorbed in the material side of everything, she moved in a self-created atmosphere Blair could not abide. He went hungry many a time, rather than sit at table with guests such as Mrs. Maynard delighted to honor. Blair and Margaret had become estranged, and Blair spent most of his time alone, reading or dreaming, but mostly sleeping. He knew he grew weaker every day, and his weakness appeared to induce slumber. On New Year's Day, after dinner, he fell asleep in a big chair, across the hall from the drawing-room, and when he awoke, the drawing-room was full of people making New Year's calls. If there was anything Blair hated, it was to thump on his crutch past curious, cold-eyed persons. So he remained where he was, hoping not to be seen. But unfortunately for him, he had exceedingly keen ears and exceedingly sensitive feelings. Some of the guests he knew very well without having to see them. The Swans and Fanchon Smith, with her brother and mother, Gerald Hartley and his bride, Helen Rapp, and a number of others prominent as Middleville's elect were recognizable by their voices. While he was sitting there, trying not to hear what he could not help hearing, a number more arrived. They talked. It gradually dawned on Blair that some gossip was rife anent a midnight marriage between his friend Daren Lane and Mel Iden. Blair was deeply shocked. Then his emotions, never calm, grew poignant. He listened. What he heard spoken of Daren and Mel made his blood boil. Sweet voices, low-pitched, well-modulated, with the intonation of culture, made witty and scarcely veiled remarks of a suggestiveness that gave rise to laughter. Voices of men, bland, blasé, deriding Daren Lane. Blair listened, and slowly his passion mounted to a white heat. And then it seemed, fatefully, in a lull of the conversation, someone remarked graciously to Mrs. Maynard that it was a pity that Blair had lost a leg in the war. Blair thumped up on his crutch, and thumped across the hall to confront this assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, pray pardon me," he said, in his high-pitched tenor, cold now, and under perfect control. "I could not help hearing your conversation, and I cannot help illuminating your minds. It seems exceedingly strange to me that people of intelligence should make the blunders they do. So strange that in the future I intend to take such as you have made as nothing but the plain, cold fact of perversion of human nature. Daren Lane is so far above your comprehension that it seems useless to defend him. I have never done it before. He would not thank me. But this once I will speak. In our group of servicemen, so few of whom came home, he was a hero. We all loved him. And for soldiers at war, that tribute is the greatest. If there was a dirty job to be done, Daren Lane volunteered for it. If there was a comrade to be helped, Daren Lane was the first to see it. He never thought of himself. The dregs of war did not engulf him, as they did so many of us. He was true to his ideal. He would have been advanced for honors many a time, but for the enmity of our captain. He won the Croix de Guerre by as splendid a feat as I saw during the war. Thank God we had some officers who treated us like men, who were men themselves. But for the majority, we common soldiers were merely beasts of burden, dogs to drive. This captain of whom I speak was a padded shape, shirker from the front line, a parader of his uniform before women. And he is that today, a chaser of women, Girls. Girls of 15. Yet he has the adulation of Middleville, while Daren Lane is an outcast. My God, is there no justice? At home here, Daren Lane has not done one thing that was not right. Some of the gossip about him is as false as hell. He has tried to do noble things. If he married Mal Iden, as you say, it was in some exalted mood to help her, or to give his name to her poor little nameless boy. Blair paused a moment in a deliberate speech that toward the end had grown breathless. The faces before him seemed swaying in a mist. As for myself, he continued in passionate hurry, I did not lose my leg. I sacrificed it. I gave my career, my youth, my health, my body. And I will soon have given my life, for my country and my people. I was proud to do it. Never for a moment have I regretted it. What I lost, what I lost was respect for, Blair choked, for the institution that had deluded me. What I lost was not my leg, but my faith in God, in my country, in the gratitude of men left at home, in the honor of women. Friday, the 10th of January, dawned cold, dark, dreary, and all day a dull clouded sky promised rain or snow. From a bride's point of view, it was not a propitious day for a wedding. A half hour before 5 o'clock, a stream of carriages began to flow towards St. Mark's, and promptly at 5, the door of the church shut upon a large and fashionable assembly. The swelling music of the wedding march pealed out. The bridal party filed into the church. The organ peals hushed. The resonant voice of a minister, with sing-song solemnity, began the marriage service. Margaret Maynard knew she stood there in the flesh, yet the shimmering white satin, the flowing veil, covered someone who was a stranger to her. And this other, this strange being who dominated her movements, stood passively and willingly by, while her despairing and truer self saw the shame and truth. She was a lie. The guests, friends, attendants, bridesmaids, the minister, the father, mother, groom, all were lies. They expressed nothing of their true feelings. The unwelcomed curious, who had crowded into the back of the church, were the sincerest, for in their eyes covetousness was openly unveiled. The guests and friends wore the conventional shallow smiles of guests and friends. They whispered to one another, "A beautiful wedding, a gorgeous gown, a perfect bride, a handsome groom," and exclaimed in their hearts, "How sad the father! How lofty, proud, exultant the mother! How like her to move heaven and earth to make this marriage!" The attendants posed awkwardly, a personification of the uselessness of their situation, and they pitied the bride while they envied him for whose friendship they stood. The bridesmaids graced their position and gloried in it, and serenely smiled, and thought that to be launched in life in such dazzling manner might be compensation for the loss of much. He of the flowing robe, of the saintly expression, of the trained earnestness, the minister who had power to unite these lives, saw nothing behind that white veil, saw only his fashionable audience, while his resonant voice rolled down the aisles of the church. "Who gives this woman to be wedded to this man?" The father answered, and straightway the years rolled back to his youth, to hope, to himself as he stood at the altar with love and trust, and then again to the present, to the failure of health and love and life, to the unalterable destiny accorded him, to the one shame of an honest if unsuccessful life, the countenancing of this marriage. The worldly mother had, for once, a full and swelling heart. For her this was the crowning moment. In one sense this fashionable crowd had been pitted against her, and she had won. What to her had been the pleading of a daughter, the importunity of a father, the reasoning of a few old-fashioned friends? The groom, who represented so much and so little in this ceremony, had entered the church with head held high, had faced his bride with gratified smile, and the altar with serene unconsciousness. Margaret Maynard saw all this, saw even the bride, with her splendidly regular loveliness. And then, out of heaven, it seemed there thundered an awful command, rolling the dream away, striking terror to her heart. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. One long, silent, terrible moment. Would not an angel appear, with flaming sword, to smite her dead? But the sing-song voice went on, like flowing silk. The last guest at Mrs. Maynard's reception had gone, reluctantly, out into the snow, and the hostess sat in her drawing-room, amid the ruins of flowers and palms. She was alone with her triumph. Mr. Maynard and Mr. Swan were smoking in the library. Owing to the storm and delicate health of the bride, the wedding journey had been postponed. Margaret was left alone, at length, in the little blue and white room which had known her as a child and maiden, where she now sat as wife. For weeks past she had been emotionless. Tonight, with that trenchant command, unanswered except in her heart, a spasm of pain had broken the serenity of her calm, and had left her quivering. "It is done," she whispered. The endless stream of congratulations, meaningless and abhorrent to her, the elaborate refreshments, the warm embraces of old friends had greatly fatigued her. But she could not rest. She paced the little room. She passed the beautiful white bridal finery, so neatly folded by the bridesmaids, and she averted her eyes. She seemed not to hate her mother, nor love her father. She had no interest in her husband. She was slipping back again into that creature apart from her real self. The house became very quiet. The snow brushed softly against the windows. A step in the hall made Margaret pause like a listening deer. A tap sounded lightly on her door. A voice awoke her at last to life and to torture. "Margaret, may I come in?" It was Swan's voice, a little softer than usual, with a subtle eagerness. "No," answered Margaret, involuntarily. "I beg your pardon, I'll wait." Swan's footsteps died away in the direction of the library. The spring of a panther was in Margaret's action as she began to repace the room. All her blood quickened to the thought suggested by her husband's soft voice. In the mirror she saw a crimsoned face and shamed eyes from which she turned away. All the pain and repression, the fight and bitter resignation and trained indifference of the past months were as if they had never been. This was her hour of real agony. Now was the time to pay the price. Pride, honor, love, never smothered, reserve rooted in the very core of a sensitive woman's heart, availed nothing. Once again catching sight of her reflection in the mirror, she stopped before it, and, crossing her hands on her heaving breast, she regarded herself with scorn. She was false to her love. She was false to herself. False to the man to whom she had sold herself. "Oh, why did I yield?" she cried. She was a coward. She belonged to the luxurious class that would suffer anything rather than lose position. Fallen had she as low as any of them. Gold had been the price of her soul. To keep her position, she must marry one man when she loved another. She cried out in her wretchedness. She felt in her whole being a bitter humiliation. She felt stir in her a terrible tumult. Margaret wondered how many thousands of girls had been similarly placed, and pitied them. She thought of the atmosphere in which she lived, where it seemed to her every mother was possessed singularly and entirely of one aim, to marry her daughter as soon as possible to a man as rich as possible. Marrying well simply meant marrying money. Only a few days before, her mother had come to her and said, "Mrs. Fisher called, and she was telling me about her daughter, Alice. It seems Alice is growing very pretty and very popular. She said she was afraid Alice had taken a liking to that Brandeth fellow, who is only a clerk. So Mrs. Fisher intends taking Alice to the seashore this summer, to an exclusive resort, of course, but one where there will be excitement and plenty of young gentlemen." At the remembrance, Margaret gave a little contemptuous laugh. A year ago she would not have divined the real purport of her mother's words. How easy that was now. Mrs. Fisher had decided that as Alice was 18, it was time a suitable husband was found for her. Poor Alice. Balls, parties, receptions there would be, and trips to the seashore, and all the other society maneuvers, made ostensibly to introduce Alice to the world. But if the truth were told in cold blood, all this was simply a parading of the girl before a number of rich and marriageable men. Poor Harry Brandeth. She recalled many marriages of friends and acquaintances. With strange intensity of purpose, she brought each one to mind, and thought separately and earnestly over her. What melancholy facts this exercise revealed! She could not recall one girl who was happy, perfectly happy, unless it was Jane Silvey who ran off with and married a telegraph operator. Jane was still bright-eyed and fresh, happy no doubt in her little house with her work and her baby, even though her people passed her by as if she were a stranger. Then Margaret remembered, with a little shock, there was another friend, a bride who had been found on her wedding night wandering in the fields. There had been some talk, quickly hushed, of a drunken husband, but it had never definitely transpired what had made her run out into the dark night. Margaret recollected the time she had seen this girl's husband, when he was drunk, beat his dog brutally. Then Margaret reflected on the gossip she never wanted to hear, yet could not avoid hearing, over her mother's tea-table, on the intimations and implications. Many things she would not otherwise have thought of again, but they now recurred and added their significance to her awakening mind. She was not keen nor analytical. She possessed only an ordinary intelligence. She could not trace her way through a labyrinth of perplexing problems. Still, suffering had opened her eyes, and she saw something terribly wrong in her mother's world. Once more she stopped pacing her room, for a step in the hall arrested her, and made her stand quivering, as if under the lash. "I won't," she breathed intensely. Swiftly and lightly she sped across her room, opened a door leading to the balcony, and went out, closing the door behind her softly. Mr. Maynard sat before the library fire with a neglected cigar between his fingers. The events of the day had stirred him deeply. The cold shock he had felt when he touched his daughter's cheek in the accustomed good-night kiss remained with him, still chilled his lips. For an hour he sat there motionless, with his eyes fixed on the dying fire, and in his mind hope, doubt, and remorse strangely mingled. Hope persuaded him that Margaret was only a girl, still sentimental and unpoised. Unquestionably she had made a good marriage. Her girlish notions about romance and love must give way to sane acceptance of real human life. After all, money meant a great deal. She would come around to a sensible view, and get that strange look out of her eyes, that strained, blighted look which hurt him. Then he writhed in his self-contempt. Doubt routed all his hope, and remorse made him miserable. A hurried step on the stairs aroused Mr. Maynard. Swan came running into the library. He was white. His sharp-featured face wore a combination of expressions. Alarm, incredulity, wonder were all visible there, but the most striking was mortification. "Mr. Maynard, Margaret has left her room. I can't find her anywhere." The father stared blankly at his son-in-law. Swan repeated his statement. "What?" All at once Mr. Maynard sank helplessly into his chair. In that moment, certainty made him an old, broken man. "She's gone," said Swan in a shaken voice. "She has run off from me. I knew she would. I knew she'd do something. I've never been able to kiss her. Only last night we quarreled about it. I tell you it's—" "Pray do not get excited," interrupted Mr. Maynard, bracing up. "I'm sure you exaggerate. Tell me what you know." "I went to her room 2 hours ago, and knocked. She was there but refused me admittance. She spoke sharply, as if she was afraid. I went and knocked again long after. She didn't answer. I knocked again and again. Then I tried her door. It was not locked. I opened it. She was not in the room. I waited, but she didn't come. I am afraid something is wrong." "She might be with her mother," faltered Mr. Maynard. "No, I'm sure not," asserted Swan. "Not tonight of all nights. Margaret has grown somewhat cold toward her mother. Besides, Mrs. Maynard retired hours ago." The father and the husband stole noiselessly up the stairs and entered Margaret's room. The light was turned on full. The room was somewhat disordered. Bridal finery lay littered about. A rug was crumpled. A wicker basket overturned. The father's instinct was true. His first move was to open the door leading out upon the balcony. In the thin snow drifted upon this porch were the imprints of little feet. Something gleamed pale blue in the light of the open door. Mr. Maynard picked it up, and with a sigh that was a groan, held it out to Swan. It was a blue satin slipper. "Heavens!" exclaimed Swan. "She's run out in the snow. She might as well be barefooted." "Shh!" warned Mr. Maynard. Unhappy and excited as he was, he did not forget Mrs. Maynard. "Let us not alarm anyone." "There, see her footsteps down the stairs," whispered Swan. "I can see them clear to the ground." "You stay here, Swan, so in case Mrs. Maynard or the servants awake, you can prevent alarm. We must think of that. I'll bring her back." Mr. Maynard descended the narrow stairway to the lower porch and went out into the yard. The storm had ceased. A few inches of snow had fallen, and in places was deeper in drifts. The moon was out and shone down on a white world. It was cold and quiet. When Mr. Maynard had trailed the footsteps across his wide lawn and saw them lead out into the street toward the park, he fell against a tree, unable for a moment to command himself. Hope he had none left, nor a doubt. On the other side of the park, hardly a quarter of a mile away, was the river. Margaret had gone straight toward it. Outside in the middle of the street he found her other slipper. She had not even stockings on now. He could tell by the impressions of her feet in the snow. He remembered quite mournfully how small Margaret's feet were, how perfectly shaped. He hurried into the park, but was careful to obliterate every vestige of her trail by walking in the soft snow directly over her footprints. A hope that she might have fainted before she could carry out her determination arose in him and gave him strength. He kept on. Her trail led straight across the park, in the shortcut she had learned and run over hundreds of times when a little girl. It was hastening her now to her death. At first her footsteps were clear-cut, distinct and wide apart. Soon they began to show evidences of weariness. The stride shortened. The imprints dragged. Here a great crushing in a snowdrift showed where she had fallen. Mr. Maynard's hope revived. He redoubled his efforts. She could not be far. How she dragged along! Then, with a leap of his heart, and a sob of thankfulness, he found her, with disheveled hair, and face white as the snow where it rested, sad and still in the moonlight. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 19. Middleville was noted for its severe winters, but this year the zero weather held off until late in January. Lane was peculiarly susceptible to the cold, and he found himself facing a discomfort he knew he could not long endure. Every day he felt more and more that he should go to a warm and dry climate, and yet he could not determine to leave Middleville. Something held him. The warmth of bright hotel lobbies and theaters and restaurants uptown was no longer available for Lane. His money had dwindled beyond the possibility of luxury, and besides he shrank now from meeting anyone who knew him. His life was empty, dreary, and comfortless. One wintry afternoon Lane did not wander round as long as usual, for the reason that his endurance was lessening. He returned early to his new quarters, and in the dim hallway he passed a slight pale girl who looked at him. She seemed familiar, but Lane could not place her. Evidently she had a room in the building. Lane hated the big barn-like house, and especially the bare, cold room where he had to seek rest. Of late he had not eaten any dinner. He usually remained in bed as long as he could, and made a midday meal answer all requirements. Appetite, like many other things, was failing him. This day he sat upon his bed, in the abstraction of the lonely and unhappy, until the cold forced him to get under the covers. His weary eyelids had just closed when he was awakened. The confused sense of being torn from slumber gave way to a perception of a voice in the room next to his. It was a man's voice, rough with the huskiness Lane recognized as peculiar to drunkards. And the reply to it seemed to be a low-toned appeal from a woman. "Playing off sick, eh? You don't want to work. But you'll get me some money, girl, do you hear?" A door slammed, rattling the thin partition between the two rooms, and heavy footsteps dragged in the hall and on the stairway. Sleep refused to come back to Lane. As he lay there, he was surprised at the many sounds he heard. The ramshackle old structure, which he had supposed almost vacant, was busy with life. Stealthy footfalls in the hallways passed and repassed. A piano drummed somewhere. A man's loud voice rang out, and a woman's laugh, faint, hollow, and far away, like the ghost of laughter, returned in echo. The musical clinking of glasses, the ring of a cash register, the rattling click of pool balls came up from below. Presently Lane remembered the nature of the place. It was a house of night. In daylight it was silent. Its inmates were asleep. But as the darkness unfolded a cloak over it, all the hidden springs of its obscure humanity began to flow. Lying there with the woman's appeal haunting him and all those sounds in his ears, he thought of their meaning. The drunkard with his lust for money, his moaning victim, the discordant piano, the man with the vacant laugh, the lost hope and youth in the woman's that echoed it, the stealing, slipping feet of those who must tread softly, all conveyed to Lane that he had awakened in another world, a world which shunned sunlight. Toward morning he dozed off into a fitful sleep which lasted until 10 o'clock, when he arose and dressed. As he was about to go out, a knock on the door of the room next to his recalled the incident of the night. He listened. Another knock followed, somewhat louder, but no response came from within. "Say, you in there!" cried a voice Lane recognized as the landlady's. She rattled the doorknob. A girl's voice answered weakly. "Come in." Lane heard the door open. "I wants my room rent. I can't get $1 out of your drunken father. Will you pay? It's 4 weeks overdue." "I have no money." "Then get out and leave me the room." The landlady spoke angrily. "I'm ill. I can't get up." The answer was faint. Lane opened his door quickly and confronted the broad person of the landlady. "How much does the woman owe?" he asked quietly. "Uh-huh." The exclamation was trenchant with meaning. $20, if it's anything to you." "I'll pay it. I think I heard the woman say she was ill." "She says she is." "May I be of any assistance?" "Ask her." Lane glanced into the little room, a counterpart of his. But it was so dark he could see nothing distinctly. "May I come in? Let me raise the blind. There, the sun is fine this morning. Now, may I not—" He looked down at a curly head and a sweet pretty face that he knew. "I know you," he said, groping among past associations. "I am Rose Clymer," she whispered, and a momentary color came into her wan cheeks. "Rose Clymer? Bessie Bell's friend?" "Yes, Mr. Lane. I'm not so surprised as you. I recognized you last night." "Then it was you who passed me in the hall?" "Yes." "Well, and you're ill? What is the matter?" "Ah, last night it was your father, I heard." Yes, she answered. I've not been well since, for a long time, and I gave out last night. Here I am talking when I might be of some use, said Lane, and he hurried out of the room. The landlady had discreetly retired to the other end of the hall. He thrust some money into her hands. She seems pretty sick. Do all you can for her. Be kind to her. I'll pay. I'm going for a doctor. He telephoned for Dr. Bronson. An hour later, Lane, coming upstairs from his meal, met the physician at Rose's door. He looked strangely at Lane and shook his head. Daren, how is it I find you here in this place? Beggars can't be choosers, answered Lane, with his old, frank smile. Humph! Exclaimed the doctor, gruffly. How about the girl? Asked Lane. She's in bad shape, replied Bronson. Lane, are you aware of her condition? Why she's ill, that's all I know, replied Lane slowly. Rose didn't tell me what ailed her. I just found out she was here. Dr. Bronson looked at Lane. Too bad you didn't find out sooner. I'll call again today and see her. And say, Daren, you look all in yourself. Never mind me, Doctor. It's mighty good of you to look after Rose. I know you've more patients than you can take care of. Rose has nothing, and her father's a poor devil. But I'll pay you. Never mind about money, rejoined Bronson, turning to go. Lane could learn little from Rose. Questions seemed to make her shrink, so Lane refrained from them and tried to cheer her. The landlady had taken a sudden liking to Lane, which evinced itself in her change of attitude toward Rose, and she was communicative. She informed Lane that the girl had been there about 2 months, that her father had made her work till she dropped. Old Clymer had often brought men to the hotel to drink and gamble, and to the girl's credit she had avoided them. For several days Dr. Bronson came twice daily to see Rose. He made little comment upon her condition, except to state that she had developed peritonitis, and he was not hopeful. Soon Rose took a turn for the worse. The doctor came to Lane's room and told him the girl would not have the strength to go through with her ordeal. Lane was so shocked he could not speak. Dr. Bronson's shoulders sagged a little, an unusual thing for him. I'm sorry, Daren, he said. I know you wanted to help the poor girl out of this, but too late. I can ease her pain, and that's all. Strangely shaken and frightened, Lane lay down in the dark. The partition between his room and Rose's might as well have been paper for all the sound it deadened. He could have escaped that, but he wanted to be near her. And he listened to Rose's moans in the darkness. Lane shuddered there, helpless, suffering, realizing. Then the foreboding silence became more dreadful than any sound. It was terrible for Lane. That strange cold knot in his breast, that coil of panic, seemed to spring and tear, quivering through all his body. What had he known of torture, of sacrifice, of divine selflessness? He understood now how the loved and guarded woman went down into the valley of the shadow for the sake of a man. Likewise, he knew the infinite tragedy of a ruined girl who lay in agony, gripped by relentless nature. Lane was called into the hall by Mrs. O'Brien. She was weeping. Bronson met him at the door. She's dying, he whispered. You better come in. I've phoned to Dr. Wallace. Lane went in, almost blinded. The light seemed dim. Yet he saw Rose with a luminous glow radiating from her white face. I feel so light, she said, with a wan smile. Lane sat by the bed, but he could not speak. The moments dragged. He had a feeling of their slow but remorseless certainty. Then there were soft steps outside. Mrs. O'Brien opened the door, and Dr. Wallace entered the room. My child, he gravely began, bending over her. Rose's big eyes, with their strained, questioning gaze, sought his face, and Dr. Bronson's, and Lane's. Rose, are you in pain? The burning's gone, she said. My child, began Dr. Wallace again, your pain is almost over. Will you not pray with me? No, I never was two-faced, replied Rose, with a weary shake of the tangled curls. I won't show yellow now. Lane turned away blindly. It was terrible to think of her dying, bitter, unrepentant. Oh, if I could hope, murmured Rose, to see my mother. Then there were shuffling steps outside and voices. The door was opened by Mrs. O'Brien. Old Clymer crossed the threshold. He was sober, haggard, grieved. He had been told. No one spoke as he approached Rose's bedside. Lass, he began brokenly. Then he sought from the men confirmation of a fear born by a glance into Rose's white, still face. And silence answered him. Lass, if you're goin', tell me, who was to blame? No one but myself, father, she replied. Tell me, who was to blame? Demanded Clymer, harshly. Her pale lips curled a little bitterly, and suddenly, as a change seemed to come over her, they set that way. She looked up at Lane with a different light in her eyes. Then she turned her face to the wall. Lane left the room to pace up and down the hall outside. His thoughts seemed deadlocked. By and by, Dr. Bronson came out with Dr. Wallace, who was evidently leaving. She is unconscious and dying, said Dr. Bronson to Lane, and then bade the minister good-bye and returned to the room. How strangely bitter she was, exclaimed Dr. Wallace to Lane. Yet she seemed such a frank, honest girl. Her attitude was an acknowledgment of sin, but she did not believe it herself. She seemed to have a terrible resentment, not against one man or many persons, but perhaps life itself. She was beyond me. A modern girl. A pagan. But such a brave, loyal, generous little soul. What a pity. I find my religion at fault, because it can accomplish nothing these days. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 20. Lane took Rose's death to heart as if she had been his sister or sweetheart. The exhaustion and exposure he was subjected to during these days dragged him farther down. One bitter February day he took refuge in the railroad station. The old Negro porter who had known Lane since he was a boy evidently read the truth of Lane's condition, for he contrived to lead him back into a corner of the irregular room. It was an obscure corner, rather hidden by a supporting pillar and the projecting end of a news counter. This seat was directly over the furnace in the cellar. Several pipes, too hot to touch, came up through the floor. It was the warmest place Lane had found, and he sat there for hours. He could see the people passing to and fro through the station, arriving and leaving on trains, without himself being seen. That afternoon was good for him, and he went back next day. But before he could get to the coveted seat, he was accosted by Blair Maynard. Lane winced under Blair's piercing gaze, and the haggard face of his friend renewed Lane's deadened pangs. Lane led Blair to the warm corner, and they sat down. It had been many weeks since they had seen each other. Blair talked in one uninterrupted flow for an hour, and so the life of the people Lane had given up was once again open to him. It was like the scoring of an old wound. Then Lane told what little there was to tell about himself, and the things he omitted Blair divined. After that they sat silent for a while. Of course he knew Mel's boy died, said Blair presently. Oh, no, exclaimed Lane. Hadn't you heard? I thought, of course you... Yes, he died some time ago. Croup or flu, I forget. Dead, whispered Lane, and he leaned forward to cover his face with his hands. He had seemed so numb to feeling, but now a storm shook him. Dare it's better for him, and Mel too, said Blair, with a hand going to his friend's shoulder. That idea never occurred to me until day before yesterday when I ran into Mel. She looked, oh, I can't tell you how, but I got that strange impression." Did she ask about me?" queried Lane, hoarsely, as he uncovered his face and sat back. "She certainly did," replied Blair, warmly, "and I lied like a trooper. I didn't know where you were or how you were, but I pretended you were okay." "And then?" asked Lane, breathlessly. "She said, 'Tell Daren I must see him.' I promised and set out to find you. I was pretty lucky to run into you. And now, old sport, let me get personal, will you?" "Go as far as you like," replied Lane, in muffled voice. "Well, I think Mel loves you," went on Blair, in hurried softness. "I always thought so, even when we were kids. And now I know it. And Lord, Dare, you just ought to see her now. She's lovely. And she's your wife." "What if she is, both lovely and my wife?" queried Lane, bitterly. "If I were you, I'd go to her. I'd sure let her take care of me. Dare, the way you're living is horrible. I have a home such as it is. My room is warm and clean, and I can stay in it. But you, Dare, it hurts me to see you, as you are." "No," interrupted Lane, passionately. The temptation Blair suggested was not to be borne. Lane met Blair the next afternoon at the station, and again on the next. That established a habit in which both found much comfort and some happiness. Thereafter they met every day at the same hour. Often for long they sat silent, each occupied with his own thoughts. Occasionally Blair would bring a package which contained food he had ransacked from the larder at home. Together they would fall upon it like two schoolboys. But what Lane was most grateful for was just Blair's presence. It was distressing, then, after these meetings had extended over a period of 2 weeks, to be confronted one afternoon by a new station agent, who called Blair and Lane bums and ordered them out of the place. Blair raised his crutch to knock the man down, but Lane intercepted it and got his friend out of the station. It was late afternoon, with the sun going down over the hill across the railroad yards. Blair stood a moment bareheaded, with the light on his handsome, haggard face. How frail he seemed, too frail of body for the magnificent spirit so flashing in his eyes, so scathing on his bitter lips. Lane bade him good-bye and turned away, with a strange intimation that this was the last time he would ever see Blair alive. Wretched and desperate, Lane bought drink and took it to his room with him. On that dark winter night he sat by the window of his room. Insensible now to the cold, to the wind moaning outside, to the snow whirling against the pane, he lived with phantoms. To and fro glided the wraith forms, vanishing and appearing. The soft rustling sound of the snow was the rustle of their movements. Across the gleam of light, streaking coldly through the pane, flickering fitfully on the wall, floated shadows and faces. He did not know when he succumbed to drowsy weakness. But he awoke at daylight, lying on the floor, stiff with cold. Drink helped him to drag through that day. Then something happened to him, and time meant nothing. Night and day were the same. He did not eat. When he lay back upon his bed he became irrational, yet seemed to be conscious of it. When he sat up his senses slowly righted. But he preferred the spells of aberration. Sometimes he was possessed by hideous nightmares, out of which he awoke with the terror of a child. Then he would have to sit up in the dark, in a cold sweat, and wait, until he dared to lie back again. In the daytime delusions grew upon him. One was that he was always hearing the strange voices of the river, and another that he was being pursued by an old woman, clad in a flowing black mantle, with a hood on her head and a crooked staff in her hand. The voices and apparition came to him, now in his waking hours. They came suddenly, without any prelude or warning. He explained them as odd fancies resulting from strong drink. They grew on him until his harsh laugh could not shake them off. He managed occasionally to drag himself out of the house. In the streets he felt this old black hag following him, but later she came to him in the lonely silence of his room. He never noticed her unless he glanced behind him, and he was powerless to resist that impulse. At length the dreary old woman, who seemed to grow more gaunt and ghostly every day, took the form in Lane's disordered fancy of the misfortune that war had put upon him. Lane dreamed once that it was a gray winter afternoon. Dark lowering clouds hung over the drab-colored hills, and a chill north wind scurried over the bare meadows, sending the dead leaves rustling over the heath and moaning through the leafless oaks. What a sad day it was, he thought, as he faced the biting wind. Sad as was his life, and a fitting one for the deed on which he had determined. Long since he had left the city and was on the country road. He ascended a steep hill. From its highest point he looked back toward the city he was leaving forever. Faint it lay in the distance, only a few of its white spires shining out dimly from the purple haze. What was that dark shadow? Far down the winding road he discerned an object moving slowly up the hill. Closer he looked, and trembled. An old woman with flowing black robes was laboriously climbing the hill. Whirling, he placed his hand on his breast, firmly grasped something there, and then strode onward. Soon he glanced over his shoulder. Yes, there she came, hobbling over the crest, her bent form and long crooked staff clearly silhouetted against the gray background. She raised the long staff and pointed it at him. Now it seemed the day was waning. Deep shadows lay in the valleys, and night already enveloped the forest. Through rents in the broken clouds, a few pale stars twinkled fitfully. Soon dark cloud curtains scurried across these spaces, shutting out the light. He plunged into the forest. His footsteps made no sound on the soft moss as he glided through wooded aisles and under giant trees. Once well into the deep woods, he turned to look behind him. He saw a shadow, blacker than the forest gloom, stealthily slipping from tree to tree. He looked no more. For hours he traveled on and on, never stopping, never looking backward, never listening, intent only on placing a great distance between him and his pursuer. He came upon a swamp where his feet sank in the soft earth, and through all the night, with tireless strength and fateful resolve, he toiled into this dreamy waste of woods and waters, until at length a huge black rock loomed up in his way. He ascended to its summit and looked beyond. It seemed now that he had reached his destination. Wood spirits and phantoms of night would mourn over him, but they would keep his secret. He peered across a shining lake and tried to pierce the gloom. No living thing moved before his vision. Silver rippling waves shimmered under that starlit sky. Tall, weird pines waved gently in the night breeze. Slender cedars, resembling specters, reared their heads toward the blue-black vault of heaven. He listened intently. There was a faint rustling of the few leaves left upon the oaks. The strange voices that had always haunted him, the murmuring of river waters, or whispering of maidens, or muttering of women, were now clear. Suddenly 2 white forms came gliding across the waters. The face of one was that of a young girl. Golden hair clustered round the face and over the fair brow. The lips smiled with mournful sweetness. The other form seemed instinct with life. The face was that of a living, breathing girl, soulful, passionate, her arms outstretched, her eyes shining with a strange, hopeful light. Down, down, down he fell and sank through chill depths, falling slowly, falling softly. The cool waters passed. He floated through misty, shadowy space. An infinitude of silence enclosed him. Then a dim and sullen roar of waters came to his ears, borne faintly, then stronger, on a breeze that was not of earth. Anguish and despair tinged that sodden wind. Weird and terrible came a cry. Steaming, boiling, burning, rumbling chaos. A fearful rushing sullen water. Then a flash of light, like a falling star, sped out of the dark clouds. Lane found himself sitting up in bed, wet and shaking. The room was dark. Someone was pounding on the door. "Hello, Lane, are you there?" called a man's deep voice. "Yes. What's wanted?" answered Lane. The door opened wide, impelled by a powerful arm. Light from the hallway streamed in over the burly form of a man in a heavy coat. He stood in the doorway, evidently trying to see. "Sick in bed, hey?" he queried, with gruff, kind voice. "I guess I am. Who are you?" "I'm Joshua Iden, and I've come to pack you out of here," he said. "No," protested Lane, faintly. "Your wife is downstairs in a taxi waiting," went on his strange visitor. "My wife," whispered Lane. "Yes, Mel Iden, my daughter. You've forgotten, maybe, but she hasn't. She learned today from Dr. Bronson how ill you were, and so she's come to take you home." Mel Iden. The name seemed a part of the past. This was only another dream, thought Lane, and slowly fell back upon his bed. "Say, aren't you able to sit up?" queried this visitor Lane took for the specter of a dream. He advanced into the room. He grasped Lane with firm hand. And then Lane realized this was no nightmare. He began to shake. "Sit up?" he echoed, vaguely. "Sure I can. You're Mel's father?" "Yes," replied the other. "Come, get out of this." "Well, you haven't much dressing to do. And that's good. Steady there." As he rose, Lane would have fallen but for a quick move of Iden's. "Only shoes and coat," said Lane, fumbling around. "There somewhere." "Here you are. Let me help. There, have you an overcoat?" "No," replied Lane. "Well, there's a robe in the taxi. Come on now, I'll come back and pack your belongings." He put an arm under Lane's and led him out into the hall and down the dim stairway to the street. Under the yellow light, Lane saw a cab, toward which Iden urged him. Lane knew that he moved, but he seemed not to have any feeling in his legs. The cabman put a hand back to open the door. "Mel, here he is," called out Iden, cheerfully. Lane felt himself being pushed into the cab. His knees failed, and he sank forward, even as he saw Mel's face. "Daren!" she cried, and caught him. Then all went black. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 21. Lane's return to consciousness was an awakening into what seemed as unreal and unbelievable as any of his morbid dreams. But he knew that his mind was clear. It did not take him a moment to realize from the feel of his body and the fact that he could not lift his hand that he had been prostrate a long time. The room he lay in was strange to him. It had a neatness and cleanliness that spoke of a woman's care. It had 2 small windows, one of which was open. Sunshine flooded in, and the twitter of swallows and hum of bees filled the air outside. Lane could scarcely believe his senses. A warm fragrance floated in. Spring. What struck Lane then most singularly was the fact of the silence. There were no city sounds. This was not the Iden home. Presently he heard soft footfalls downstairs, and a low voice, as of someone humming a tune. What then had happened? As if in answer to his query, there came from below a sound of heavy footfalls on a porch, the opening and closing of a door, a man's cheery voice, and then steps on the stairs. The door opened, and Dr. Bronson entered. "Hello, Doc," said Lane, in a very faint voice. "Well, you son of a gun!" ejaculated the doctor in delight. Then he called down the stairs. "Mel, come up here quick!" Then came a low cry and a flying patter of light feet. Mel ran past the doctor into the room. To Lane she seemed to have grown along with the enchantments his old memories had invoked. With parted lips, eager-eyed, she flashed a look from Lane to Dr. Bronson and back again. Then she fell upon her knees by the bed. "Do you know me?" she asked, her voice tremulous. "Sure. You're the wife of a poor sick soldier, Daren Lane." "Oh, doctor, he has come too," cried Mel in rapture. "Fine. I've been expecting it every day," said Dr. Bronson, rubbing his hands. "Now, Daren, you can listen all you want, but don't try to talk. You've really been improving ever since we got you out here to the country. For a while I was worried about your mind. Lately, though, you showed signs of rationality. And now all's okay. In a few days we'll have you sitting up." Dr. Bronson's prophecy was more than fulfilled. From the hour of Lane's return to consciousness, he made rapid improvement. Most of the time he slept, and, upon wakening, he seemed to feel stronger. Lane had been ill often during the last 18 months, but after this illness there was a difference, inasmuch as he began to make surprising strides toward recovery. Dr. Bronson was nonplussed, and elated. Mel seemed mute in her gratitude. Lane could have told them the reason for his improvement, but it was a secret he hid in his heart. In less than a week he was up, walking round his little room, peering out of the windows. Mel had told Lane the circumstances attending his illness. It had been late in February when she and her father had called for him at his lodgings. He had collapsed in the cab. They took him to the Iden home, where he was severely ill during March. In April he began to improve, although he did not come to his senses. One day Mr. Iden brought Jacob Lane, an uncle of Lane's, to see him. Lane's uncle had been at odds with the family for many years. There had been a time when he had cared much for his nephew Daren. The visit had evidently revived the old man's affection, for the result was that Jacob Lane offered Daren the use of a cottage and several acres of land on Sycamore River, just out of town. Joshua Iden had seen to the overhauling of the cottage, and as soon as the weather got warm, Dr. Bronson had consented to Lane's removal to the country. And in a few days after his arrival at the cottage, Lane recovered consciousness. "Well, this beats me," said Lane, for the 100th time. "Uncle Jake letting us have this farm? I thought he hated us all."
"Daren, it was your going to war, and coming back, that you were ill and fell to so sad a plight. I think if your uncle had known, he'd have helped you."
"Mel, I couldn't ask anybody for help," said Lane. "Don't you understand that?"
"You were a stubborn fellow," mused Mel.
"Me? Never. I'm the meekest of mortals. Mel, I know every rock along the river here. This is just above where at flood time the sycamore cuts across that rocky flat below and makes a bad rapid. There's a creek above and a big woods. I used to fish and hunt there a good deal." 2 weeks passed by, and Daren felt himself slowly but surely getting stronger. Every morning when he came down to breakfast he felt a little better, had a little more color in his pale cheeks. At first he could not eat, but as the days went by he regained an appetite which, to Mel's delight, manifestly grew stronger. No woman could have been brighter and merrier. She laughed at the expression on his face when he saw her hands red from hot dishwater, and she would not allow him to help her. The boast she had made to him of her housekeeping abilities had not been an idle one. She prepared the meals and kept the cottage tidy, and went about other duties in a manner that showed she was thoroughly conversant with them. The way in which she had absolutely put aside the past, her witty sallies and her innocent humor, her habit of singing while at work, the depth of her earnest conversation. In all, the sweet, wholesome strength and beauty of her nature had a remarkable effect on Lane. He began to live again. It was simply impossible to be morbid in her presence. While he was with her, he escaped from himself. The day came when he felt strong enough to take a walk. He labored up the hillside toward a wood. Thereafter he went every day and walked farther every time.
With his returning strength, there crept into his mind the dawning of a hope that he might get well. At first he denied it, denied even the conviction that he wished to live. But not long. The hope grew, and soon he found himself deliberately trying to build up his health. Every day he put a greater test upon himself, and as summer drew on, he felt his strength gradually increasing. Against Dr. Bronson's advice, he got an axe and set to work on the woodpile, very cautiously at first. Every day he wielded the axe until from sheer exhaustion he could not lift it. Then he would sit on a log and pant and scorn his weakness. What a poor man it was who could not chop wood for 10 minutes without getting out of breath. This pile of logs became to him a serious and meaning obstacle. Every morning he went at it doggedly. His back grew lame, his arms sore, his hands raw and blistered. But he did not give up. Mel seemed happy to see him so occupied, and was loath to call him, even when it was necessary. After lunch it was his habit to walk in the woods. Unmindful of weather, every day he climbed the hill, plunged into the woods, and tramped until late in the afternoon. Returning, he usually slept until Mel called him to dinner. Afterward they spent the evening in the little library. The past seemed buried. Lane's curiosity as to family and friends had not reawakened. Mel possessed a rich contralto voice which had been carefully cultivated. Every evening in the twilight, with only the flickering of the wood fire in the room, she would sit at the piano and sing. Lane would close his eyes and let the mellow voice charm his every sense. It called up his highest feelings. It lingered in his soul, thrilled along his heart, and played on the chords of love and hope. It dispelled the heavy gloom that so often pressed down upon him. It vanquished the depression that was the forerunner of his old, terrible black mood. It came about that Lane spent most of his time outdoors, in the fields, along the river, on the wooded hills. The morbid brooding lost its hold on his mind, and in its place came memories, dreams, imaginations. He walked those hills with phantoms of the past, and phantoms of his fancy. The birds sang, the leaves fluttered, the wind rustled through the branches. White clouds sailed across the blue sky. A crow cawed from a hilltop. A hawk screeched from above. The roar of the river rapids came faintly upward. And Lane saw eyes gazing dreamily downward, thoughtful at a word, looking into life, trying to pierce the veil. It was all so beautiful, so terrible. The peeping of frogs roused in Lane sensations thrilling and strange. The quick, sharp notes were suggestive of cool nights, of flooded streams and marshy places. How often Lane wandered in the dusk along the shore to listen to this chorus. At that hour twilight stole down. The dark hills rose to the pale blue sky. There was a fair star and a wisp of purple cloud, and the shadowy waters gleamed. Breaking into the trill of the frogs came the song of a lonely whippoorwill. Lane felt a better spirit resurging. He felt the silence, the beauty, the mystery, the eternal that was there. All that was small and frail was passing from him. There came a regurgitation of physical strength, a change of blood. The following morning, while Lane was laboring over his woodpile, he thought he heard voices in the front yard, and presently Mel came around the walk, accompanied by Dr. Wallace and Dr. Bronson. "Well, Lane, glad to see you," said Dr. Bronson in his hearty tones. "Dr. Wallace and I are on our way to the Grange and thought we'd stop off a minute." "How are you, Mr. Lane? I see you're taking work seriously," put in Dr. Wallace, in his kindly way. "Oh, I'm coming around all right," replied Lane. He stood there with his shirt sleeves rolled up, his face bronzed a little and now warm and moist from the exercise, with something proven about him, with a suggestion of a new force which made him different. There was an unmistakable kindliness in the regard of both men, and a scarcely veiled fear Lane was quick to read. Both men were afraid they would not find him as they had hoped to. Mel, you've chosen a charming location for a home, observed Dr. Wallace. When Mel was showing her old teacher and friend the garden and flower beds, the practical Dr. Bronson asked Lane, "Did you chop all that wood?" The doctor pointed to 3 long piles of wood, composed of short pieces regularly stacked one upon another. "I did." "How long did it take you?" "I've been weeks at it." "That's a long time, but you know, Doctor, I was in pretty poor condition. I had to go slow." "Well, you've done wonders. I want to tell you that. I hardly knew you. You're still thin, but you're gaining. I won't say now what I think. Be careful of sudden or violent exertion. That's all. You've done more than doctors can do." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 22. "Mel, come here," called Lane from the back porch. "Who the deuce are those people coming down the hill?" Mel shaded her eyes from the glare of the bright morning sun. "The lady is Miss Hill, my old schoolteacher. I'd know her as far as I could see her. Look how she carries her left arm. This is Saturday, for she has neither a lunch basket nor a prayer book in that outstretched hand. If you see Miss Hill without either, you can be certain it's Saturday. As to the gentleman, Daren, can it possibly be Colonel Pepper?" "That's the Colonel, sure as you're alive," declared Lane with alacrity. "They must be coming here. Where else could they be making for? But Mel, for them to be together. Why, the Colonel's an old sport, and Mel, you know Miss Hill." Whereupon Mel acquainted Daren with the circumstances of a romance between Miss Hill and the gallant Colonel. "Well, of all things," gasped Lane, and straightway became speechless. "You're right, Daren, they are coming in. Isn't that nice of them? Now, don't you dare show I told you anything. Miss Hill is so easily embarrassed. She's the most sensitive woman I ever knew." Lane recovered in time to go through the cottage to the front porch, and to hear Miss Hill greet Mel affectionately, and announce with the tone of a society woman that she had encountered Colonel Pepper on the way and had brought him along. Lane had met the little schoolteacher, but did not remember her as she appeared now, for she was no longer plain, and there was life and color in her face. And as for embarrassment, not a trace of it was evident in her bearing. According to Mel, the mere sight of man, much less of one of such repute as Colonel Pepper, would once have been sufficient to reduce Miss Hill to a trembling shadow. But the Colonel, none of his courage manifested an appearance now. To Lane's hearty welcome he mumbled some incoherent reply and mopped his moist red face. He was wonderfully and gorgeously arrayed in a new suit of light check, patent leather shoes, a tie almost as bright as his complexion, and he had a carnation in his buttonhole. This last proof of the Colonel's mental condition was such an overwhelming shock to Lane that all he could do for a moment was stare. The Colonel saw the stare, and it rendered him helpless. Miss Hill came to the rescue with pleasant chat and most interesting news to the exiles. She had intended coming out to the cottage for ever so long, but the weather and one thing or another falling on a Saturday had prevented until today. How pretty the little home! Did not the Colonel agree with her that it was so sweet, so cozy, and picturesquely situated? Did they have chickens? What pleasure to have chickens, and flowers too! Of course they had heard about Mr. Harry White and the widow, about the dissension in Dr. Wallace's church. Anne Margaret Maynard was far from well, and Helen Rapp had gone back home to her mother, and Bessie Bell had grown into a tall, ravishingly beautiful girl, and had distracted her mother by refusing a millionaire, and seemed very much in love with young Dalrymple. "And I've the worst class of girls I ever had," went on Miss Hill. "The one I had last year was a class of angels compared to what I have now. I reproved one girl whose mother wrote me that as long as Middleville had preachers like Dr. Wallace, and teachers like myself, there wasn't much chance of a girl being good. So I'm going to give up teaching." The little schoolmistress straightened up in her chair and looked severe. Colonel Pepper shifted uneasily, bent his glance for the 100th time on his shiny shoes, and once more had recourse to his huge handkerchief and heated brow. "Well, Colonel, it seems good to see you once more," put in Lane. "Tell me about yourself. How do you pass the time?" "Same old story, Daren, same old way. A game of billiards now and then, and a little game of cards. But I'm more lonely than I used to be." "Why, you never were lonely," exclaimed Lane. "Oh, yes, indeed I was, always," protested the colonel. "A little game of cards," mused Lane. "How well I remember. You used to have some pretty big games, too." Yes. You see, once in a while. Very seldom, just for fun," he replied. "How about your old weakness? Hope you've conquered that," went on Lane, mercilessly. The colonel was thrown into utter confusion. And when Miss Hill turned terrible eyes upon him, poor Pepper looked as if he wanted to sink through the porch. Lane took pity on him and carried him off to the garden and the river bank, where he became himself again. They talked for a while, but neither mentioned the subject that had once drawn them together. For both of them, a different life had begun. A little while afterward, Mel and Lane watched the bright figure and the slight dark one go up the hillside cityward. "What do you know about that?" ejaculated Lane for the 10th time. "Hush," said Mel, and she touched his lips with a soft, exquisite gesture. At 3 o'clock one June afternoon, Mel and Daren were lounging on a mossy bank that lined the shady side of a clear, rapid-running brook. A canoe was pulled up on the grass below them. With an expression of utter content, Lane was leaning over the brook, absorbed in the contemplation of a piece of thread which was tied to a crooked stick he held in his hand. He had gone back to his boyhood days. Just then the greatest happiness on earth was the outwitting of bright-sided minnows and golden-flecked sunfish. Mel sat nearby with her lap full of flowers which she had gathered in the long grass and was now arranging. She was dressed in blue. A sunbonnet slipped back from her head. Her glossy hair waved in the breeze. She looked as fresh as a violet. "Well, Daren, we have spent 4 delightful, happy hours. How time flies! But it's growing late, and we must go," said Mel. "Wait a minute or two," replied Lane. "I'll catch this fellow. See him bite. He's cunning. He's taken my bait time and again, but I'll get him. There, see him run with the line. It's a big sunfish." "How do you know? You haven't seen him." "I can tell by the way he bites. Ah, I've got him now," cried Lane, giving a quick jerk. There was a splash, and he pulled out a squirming eel. "Ah, the nasty thing!" cried Mel, jumping up. Lane had flung the eel back on the bank, and it just missed falling into Mel's lap. She screamed, and then, when safely out of the way, she laughed at the disgust in his face. "So it was a big sunfish? My, what a disillusion! So much for a man's boastful knowledge." "Well, if it isn't a slimy old eel. There, be off with you. Go back into the water," said Lane, as he shook the eel free from the hook. "Come, we must be starting." He pushed the canoe into the brook, helped Mel to a seat in the bow, and shoved off. In some places the stream was only a few feet wide, but there was enough room and water for the light craft, and it went skimming along. The brook turned through the woods and twisted through the meadows, sometimes lying cool and dark in the shade, and again shining in the sunlight. Often Lane would have to duck his head to get under the alders and willows. Here in an overshadowed bend of the stream a heron rose, lumbering from his weedy retreat, and winged his slow flight away out of sight. A water wagtail, that cunning sentinel of the brooks, gave a startled tweet, tweet, and went flitting like a gray streak of light round the bend. "Daren, please don't be so energetic," said Mel nervously. "I'm strong as a horse now. Hello, what's that?" "I didn't hear anything." "I imagined I heard a laugh or shout." The stream was widening now as it neared its mouth. Lane was sending the canoe along swiftly with vigorous strokes. It passed under a water gate, round a quick turn in the stream, where a bridge spanned it, and before Lane had a suspicion of anything unusual, he was right upon a merry picnic party. There were young men and girls resting on the banks, and several sitting on the bridge. Automobiles were parked back on the bank. Lane swore under his breath. He recognized Margaret, Dick Swan, and several other old-time acquaintances and friends of Mel's. "Who is it?" asked Mel. Her back was turned. She did not look round, though she heard voices. "It doesn't matter," said Lane calmly. He would have given the world to spare Mel the ordeal before her, but that was impossible. He put more power into his stroke, and the canoe shot ahead. It passed under the bridge, not 20 feet from Margaret Swan. There was a strange, eager, wondering look in Margaret's clear eyes as she recognized Mel. Then she seemed to be swallowed up by the green willows. "That was damned annoying," muttered Lane to himself. He could have met them all face to face without being affected, but he realized how painful this meeting must be to Mel. These were Mel's old friends. He had caught Margaret's glance. Old memories came surging back. His gaze returned to Mel. Her face was grave and sad. Her eyes had darkened, and there was a shadow in them. His glance sought the green-lined channel ahead. The canoe cut the placid water, turned the last bend, and glided into the swift river. Soon Lane saw the little cottage shining white in the light of the setting sun. One afternoon, as Lane was returning from the woods, he met a car coming out of the grassy road that led down to his cottage. As he was about to step aside, a gay voice hailed him. He waited. The car came on. It contained Holt Dalrymple and Bessie Bell. "Say, don't you dodge us," called Holt. "Daren Lane!" screamed Bessie. Then the car halted, and with 2 strides, Lane found himself face to face with the young friends he had not seen for months. Holt appeared a man now. And Bessie, no longer with bobbed hair, older, taller, changed incalculably, struck him as having fulfilled her girlish promise of character and beauty. "Well, it's good to see you, youngsters," said Lane, as he shook hands with them. Holt seemed trying to hide emotion. But Bessie, after that first scream, sat staring at Lane with a growing, comprehending light in her purple eyes. Suddenly she burst out. "Daren, you're well. Oh, how glad I am. Holt, just look at him." "I'm looking, Bess, and if he's really Daren Lane, I'll eat him," responded Holt. "This is all I needed to make today the happiest day of my life," said Bessie, with serious sweetness. "This? Do you mean meeting me? I'm greatly flattered, Bessie," said Lane with a smile. Then both a blush and a glow made her radiant. "Daren, I'm 16 today. Holt and we're engaged. I told Mother and expected a row. She was really pleased. And then seeing you well again. Why, Daren, you've actually got color. Then Holt has been given a splendid business opportunity. And, oh, it's all too good to be true." "Well, of all things," cried Lane, when he had a chance to speak. "You two engaged. I could never tell you how glad I am." Lane felt that he could have hugged them both. "I congratulate you with all my heart. Now, Holt, Bessie, make a go of it. You're the luckiest kids in the world." "Daren, we've both had our fling, and we've both been hurt," said Bessie seriously. "And you bet we know how lucky we are, and what we owe Daren Lane for our happiness today." "Bessie, that means a great deal to me," replied Lane earnestly. "I know you'll be happy. You have everything to live for. Just be true to yourself." So the moment of feeling passed. "We went down to your place," said Holt, "and stayed a while, waiting for you." "Daren, I think Mel is lovely. May I not come often to see you both?" added Bessie. "You know how pleased we'll be." "Bessie, do you ever see my sister Lorna?" asked Lane hesitantly. "Yes, I see her, now and then. Only the other day I met her in a store. Daren, she's getting some sense. She has a better position now, and she said she was not going with any fellow but Harry." "And my mother?" Lane went on. "She is quite well," Lorna said, "and they are getting along well now. Lorna hinted that a relative, an uncle, I think, was helping them." Lane was silent a moment, too stirred to trust his voice. Presently he said, "Bessie, your birthday has brought happiness to someone besides yourself." He bade them good-bye and strode on down the hill toward the cottage. How strangely meetings change the future. Holt's pride of possession in Bessie brought poignantly back to Lane his own hidden love for Mel. And Bessie's rapture of amaze at his improvement in health put Lane face to face with a possibility he had dreamed of but had never believed in, that he might live. That night was for Lane a sleepless one. He seemed to have traveled in a dreamy circle, and was now returning to memories and pangs from which he had long been free. Next morning, without any hint to Mel of his intentions, he left the cottage and made his way into town. Almost he felt as he had upon his return from France. He dropped in to see his mother and was happy to find her condition of mind and health improved. She was overjoyed to see Lane. Her surprise was pitiful. She told him she was sure that he had recovered. It was this matter of his physical condition that had brought Lane into Middleville. For many months he had resigned himself to death, and now he could not deny even his morbid fancy that he felt stronger than at any time since he left France. He had worked hard to try to get well, but he had never, in his heart, believed that possible. Lane called upon Dr. Bronson and asked to be thoroughly examined. The doctor manifestly found the examination a task of mounting gratification. At length he concluded. "Daren, I told you over a year ago I didn't know of anything that could save your life," he said. "I didn't. But something has saved your life. You are 30 pounds heavier and gaining fast. That hole in your back is healed. Your lungs are nearly normal. You have only to be careful of a very violent physical strain. That weak place in your back seems gone. You're going to live, my boy. There has been some magic at work. I'm very happy about it. How little doctors know." Dazed and stunned by this intelligence, Lane left the doctor's residence and turned through town on his way homeward. As he plodded on, he began to realize the marvelous truth. What would Blair say? He hurried to a telephone exchange to acquaint his friend with the strange thing that had happened. But Blair had been taken to a sanitarium in the mountains. Lane hurried out of town into the country, down the river road, to the cottage, there to burst in upon Mel. "Daren," she cried in alarm, "what's happened?" She rose unsteadily, her eyes dilating. "Dr. Bronson said I was well," panted Lane. "Oh, Daren, is that it?" she replied, with a wonderful light coming to her face. "I've known that for weeks." "After all, I'm not going to die. My God." Lane rushed out and strode along the river and followed the creek into the woods. Once hidden in the leafy recesses, he abandoned himself to a frenzy of rapture. What he had given up had come back to him. Life. And he lay on his back with his senses magnified to an intense degree. The day was late in June, and a rich, thick amber light floated through the glades of the forest. Majestic white clouds sailed in the deep blue sky. The sun shone hot down into the glades. Under the pines and maples there was a cool, sweet shade. Wild flowers bloomed. A fragrance of the woods came on the gentle breeze. The leaves rustled. The melancholy song of a hermit thrush pierced the stillness. A crow cawed from a high oak. The murmur of shallow water running over rocks came faintly to Lane's ears. Lane surrendered utterly to the sheer primitive exultation of life. The supreme ecstasy of that hour could never have been experienced but for the long, hopeless months which had preceded it. For a long time he lay there in a transport of the senses, without thinking. As soon as thought regained dominance over his feelings, there came a subtle change in his reaction to this situation. He had forgotten much. He had lived in a dream. He had unconsciously grown well. He had been strangely, unbelievably happy. Why? Mel Iden had nursed him, loved him, inspired him back to health. Her very presence near him, even unseen, had been a profound happiness. He made the astonishing discovery that for months he had thought of little else besides his wife. He had lived a lonely life, in his room, and in the open, but all of it had been dominated by his dreams and fancies and emotions about her. He had roused from his last illness with a past apparently dead. There was no future, so he lived in the moment, the hour. While he lay awake in the silence of night, or toiled over his woodpile, or wandered by the brook under the trees, his dreamy thoughts centered about her. And now the truth burst upon him. His love for her had been stronger than his ruined health and blasted life, stronger than misfortune, stronger than death. It had made him well. He had not now to face death, but life, and the revelation brought on shuddering dread. Lane lingered in the woods until late afternoon. Then he felt forced to return to the cottage. The look of the whole world seemed changed. All was actual, vivid, striking. Mel's loveliness burst upon him as new and strange and terrible as the fact of his recovery. He had hidden his secret from her. He had been like a brother, kind, thoughtful, gay at times, always helpful. But he had remained aloof. He had basked in the sunshine of her presence, dreamily reveling in the consciousness of what she was to him. That hour had passed forever. He saw her now as his wife, a girl still, one who had been cruelly wronged by life, who had turned her back upon the past, and who lived for him alone. She had beauty and brains, a wonderful voice, and personality that might have fitted her for any career or station in life. She thought only of him. She had found content in ministering to him. She was noble and good. In the light of these truths coming to him, Lane took stock of his love for Mel. It had come to be too mighty a thing to understand in a moment. He lived with it in the darkness of midnight and in the loneliness of the hills. He had never loved Helen. Always he had loved Mel Iden, all his life. Clear as a crystal he saw the truth. The war with its ruin for both of them had only augmented the powers to love. Lane's year of agony in Middleville had been the mere cradling of a mounting and passionate love. He must face it now, no longer in dreamy, lulled unconsciousness, but in all its insidious and complex meaning. The spiritual side of it had not changed. This girl with the bloom of woman's loveliness upon her, with her grace and sweetness and fire, with the love that comes only once in life, belonged to him, was his wife. She did not try to hide anything. She was unconscious of appeal. Her wistfulness came from her lonely soul. The longer Lane dwelt on this matter of his love for Mel, the deeper he found it, the more inexplicable and alluring. And when at last it stood out appallingly, master of him, so beautiful and strange and bitter, he realized that between him and Mel was an insurmountable and indestructible barrier. Then came storm and strife of soul. Night and day the conflict went on. Outwardly he did not show much sign of his trouble, though he often caught Mel's dark eyes upon him, sadly conjecturing. He worked in the garden, he fished the creek, and rode miles on the river. He wandered in the woods. And the only change that seemed to rise out of his tumult was increasing love for this girl with whom his fate had been linked. So once more Lane became a sufferer, burdened by pangs, a wanderer along the naked and lonely shore of grief. His passion and his ideal were at odds. Unless he changed his nature, his reverence for womanhood, he could never realize the happiness that might become his. All that he had sacrificed had indeed been in vain. But he had been true to himself. His pity for Mel was supreme. It was only by the most desperate self-control that he could resist taking her in his arms, confessing his love, swearing with lying lips he had forgotten the wrong done her, and asking her to face the future as his loving wife. The thought was maddening. It needed no pity for Mel to strengthen it. He needed love. He needed to fulfill his life. But Lane did not yield, though he knew that if he continued to live with Mel, in time the sweetness and enchantment of her would be too great for him. This he confessed. More and more he had to fight his jealousy and the treacherous imagination that would create for him scenes of torment. He cursed himself as base and ignoble. Yet the truth was always there. If Mel had only loved the father of her child, if she had only loved blindly and passionately as a woman, it would have been different. But her sacrifice had not been one of love. It had been one of war. It had the nobility of woman's sacrifice to the race. But as an individual, she had perished. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 23. Summer waned. The long hot days dragged by. The fading rushes along the river drooped wearily over their dry beds. The yellowing leaves of the trees hung dejected. They were mute petitioners for cool breezes and rain. The grasshoppers chirped monotonously. The locusts screeched shrilly, both being products of the long hot summer, and survivors of the heat, inclined to voice their exultation far into the fall season. September yielded them full sway, and burned away day by day, week by week, dusty and scorching, without even a promise of rain. October, however, dawned misty and dark. The clouds crept up reluctantly at first, and then, as if to make amends for neglect, trooped black and threatening toward the zenith. Storm followed storm, and at evening, after the violent crashing thunder and vivid lightning and driving torrents of rain had ceased, a soft, steady downpour persisted all night and all the next day. The drought was broken. A rainy fall season was prophesied. The old danger of the river rising in flood was feared. After the sere and lifeless color of the fields and forests, what a welcome relief to Daren Lane were the freshened green, the dawning red, the tinging gold. The forest on the hill was soft and warm, and but for the gleams of autumn would have showed some of the tenderness of spring. Down in the lowlands a sea of color waved under a blue, smoky, melancholy haze. Lane climbed high that Sunday afternoon and penetrated deep into the woods. There was rest here. The forest was rich, warm with the scent of pine, of arborvitae. There was the haunting promise of more brilliant hues. Thoughts swept through Lane's mind. The great striving world was out of sight. Here in the gold-flecked shade, under the murmuring pines and pattering poplars, there was a world full of joy, wise in its teaching, significant of the glory that was fading but which would come again. Lane loved the low hills, the deep colorful woods in autumn. There he lost himself. He learned. Silence and solitude taught him. From there he had vision of the horde of men writing down the false, impossible trails of the world. He felt the sweetness, the frailty, the dependence, the glory and the doom of women battling with life. He realized the hopeless traits of human nature. Like dead scales, his egotism dropped from him. He divined the weaving of chances, the unknown and unnamed, the pondering fates in store. The dominance of pain over all, the wraith of the past, the importunity of a future never to be gained, the insistence of nature, ever pressing closer its ruthless claims. All these which became intelligible to Lane could not keep life from looming sweet, hopeful, wonderful, worthy man's best fight. and sometimes the old haunting voices whispered to him out of the river shadows. Deeper, different, strangely more unintelligible than ever before, calling more to his soul. Next morning Lane got up at the usual hour and went outdoors, but returned almost immediately. "The river is rising fast. Listen. Hear that roar? There's a regular old Niagara just below." "I imagined that roar was the wind." "The water has come up 3 feet since daylight. I guess I'll go down now and pull in some driftwood." "Oh, Daren, don't be so adventurous. When the river is high, there's a dangerous rapid below." "You're right about that, but I won't take any risks. I can easily manage the boat, and I'll be careful." The following 3 days it rained incessantly. Outside on the gravel walks there was a ceaseless drip, drip, drip. Friday evening the rain ceased. The murky clouds cleared away, and for a few moments a rainbow mingled its changing hues with the ruddy glow of the setting sun. The next day dawned bright and clear. Lane was indeed grateful for a change. Mel had been unaccountably depressed during those gloomy days, and it worried him that this morning she did not appear her usual self. "Mel, are you well?" he asked. "Yes, I am perfectly well," she replied. "I couldn't sleep much last night on account of that roar." "Don't wonder. This flood will be the greatest ever known in Middleville." "Yes, and that makes more suffering for the poor." "There are already many homeless. It's fortunate our cottage is situated on this high bank. Just look. I declare, jostling logs and whirling drifts. There's a pen of some kind with an object upon it." "It's a pig. Oh, poor piggy," said Mel compassionately. 100 yards out in the rushing yellow current, a small house or shed drifted swiftly downstream. Upon it stood a pig. The animal seemed to be stolidly contemplating the turbid flood, as if unaware of its danger. Here the river was 1/2 mile wide, and full of trees, stumps, fences, bridges, sheds. All kinds of drifts. Just below the cottage, the river narrowed between 2 rocky cliffs and roared madly over reefs and rocks, which at a low stage of water furnished a playground for children. But now that space was terrible to look upon, and the dull roar, with a hollow boom at intervals, was dreadful to hear. "Daren, I've kept something from you," said Mel nervously. "I should have told you yesterday." "What?" interrupted Lane sharply. "It's this. It's about poor Blair. He's dead." Lane stared at her white face as if it were that of a ghost. "Blair, you should have told me. I must go to see him." It was not a long ride from the terminus of the car line to where the Maynards lived, yet measured by Lane's growing distress of mind, it seemed a never-ending journey. He breathed a deep breath of relief when he got off the car, and when the Maynard homestead loomed up dark and silent, he hung back slightly. A maid admitted Lane and informed him that Mr. Maynard was ill and Mrs. Maynard would not see anyone. Margaret was not at home. The maid led Lane across the hall into the drawing room and left him alone. In the middle of the room stood a long, black, cloth-covered box. Lane stepped forward. Upon the dark background, in striking contrast, lay a white, stern face, marble-like in its stone-cold rigidity. Blair, his comrade. The moment Lane saw the face, his strange fear and old gloomy bitterness returned. Something shot through him which trembled in his soul. To him the story of Blair's sacrifice was there to read in his quiet face, and with it was an expression he had never seen, a faint wonder of relief, which suggested peace. How strange to look upon Blair and find him no longer responsive. Something splendid, loyal, generous, loving had passed away. Gone was the vital spark that had quickened and glowed to noble thoughts. Gone was the strength that had been weakness. Gone the quick, nervous, high-strung spirit. Gone the love that had no recompense. The drawn face told of physical suffering. Hard Blair had found the world. bitter the reward of the soldier, wretched the unholy worship of money and luxury, vain and hollow mockery the home of his boyhood. Lane went down the path and out of the gate. He had faint perceptions of the dark trees along the road. He came to a little pine grove. It was very quiet. There was a hum of insects, and the familiar, sad, ever-present swishing of the wind through the trees. He listened to its soft moan, and it eased the intensity of his feelings. This emotion was new to him. Death, however, had touched him more than once. Well he remembered his stunned faculties, the unintelligible mystery, the awe and the grief consequent on the death of his first soldier comrade in France. But this was different. It was a strange disturbance of his heart. Oppression began to weight him down, and a nameless fear. He had to cross the river on his way home to the cottage. In the middle of the bridge he halted to watch the sliding flood go over the dam, to see the yellow turgid threshing of waves below. The mystic voices that had always assailed his ears were now roaring. They had a message for him. It was death. Had he not just looked upon the tragic face of his comrade? Out over the tumbling waters Lane's strained gaze swept, up and down, to and fro, while the agony in his heart reached its height. The tumult of the flood resembled his soul. He spent an hour there, then turned slowly homeward. He stopped at the cottage gate. It was now almost dark. The evening star, lonely and radiant, peeped over the black hill. With some strange working at his heart, with some strange presence felt, Lane gazed at the brilliant star. How often had he watched it? Out there in the gloom somewhere, perhaps near at hand, had lurked the grim enemy waiting for Blair, that now might be waiting for him. He trembled. The old morbidness knocked at his heart. He shivered again and fought against something intangible. The old conviction thrust itself upon him. He had been marked by fate, life, war, death. He knew it. He had only forgotten. "Daren! Daren!" Mel's voice broke the spell. Lane made a savage gesture, as if he were in the act of striking. Thought of Mel recalled the stingingly sweet and bitter fact of his love, and of life that called so imperiously. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 24. If Amanda would only marry me, sighed Colonel A. Pepper, as he stacked the few dishes on the cupboard shelf and surveyed his untidy little kitchen with disparaging eyes. The once contented colonel was being consumed by two great fires, remorse and love. For more years than he could remember, he had been a victim of a deplorable habit. Then two soft eyes shone into his life, and in their light he saw things differently, and he tried to redeem himself. Even good fortune, in the shape of some half-forgotten meadow property suddenly becoming valuable, had not revived his once genial spirits. Remorse was with him, because Miss Hill refused to marry him till he overcame the habit which had earned him undesirable fame. So day by day poor Colonel Pepper grew sicker of his lonely rooms, his lonely life, and of himself. If Amanda only would, he murmured for the 1,000th time, and taking his hat he went out. The sunshine was bright, but did not give him the old pleasure. He walked and walked, taking no interest in anything. Presently he found himself on the outskirts of Middleville, within sound of the muffled roar of the flooded river, and he wandered in its direction. At sight of the old wooden bridge, he remembered he had read that it was expected to give way to the pressure of the rushing water. On the levee, which protected the low-lying country above the city, were crowds of people watching the river. "You've no rivers like that in Germany," observed a half-drunken Irishman. He and several more of his kind evidently were teasing a little German. Colonel Pepper had not stood there long before he heard a number of witticisms from these red-faced men. After the manner of his kind, the German had stolidly swallowed the remarks about his big head, and its shock of stubby hair, and his checked buff trousers. But at reference to his native country, his little blue eyes snapped, and he made a remark that this river was extremely like one in Germany. At this the characteristic contrary spirit of the Irishman burst forth. "Dutchy, I'd like you to know you're exaggerating," he said. "Germany ain't big enough for a river the like of this, and I'll leave it to me intelligent-looking friend here." Colonel Pepper, thus appealed to, blushed, looked embarrassed, coughed, and then replied that he thought Germany was quite large enough for such a river. "Did he study geography?" questioned the Irishman with fine scorn. Colonel Pepper retired within himself. The unsteady and excitable fellow had been crowded to the rear by his comrades, who evidently wished to lessen, in some degree, the possibilities of a fight. "What's in them rivers you're spouting about?" asked one. "Vater, of course." "Me wouldn't shoot, friend. You mind beer. Beer." "You insult me, you red-headed—" "Was that Dutchman addressing of me?" demanded the half-drunken Irishman, trying to push by his friends. "It'd be a finer river if it wasn't yaller," said a peacemaker, holding his comrade. In the slight scuffle which ensued, one of the men unintentionally jostled the German. His pipe fell to the ground. He bent to recover it. Through Colonel Pepper's whole being shot the lightning of his strange impulse. A tingling tremor ran over him. 1,000 giants lifted and swung his arm. He fought to check it, but in vain. With his blood bursting, with his strength expending itself in one irresistible effort, with his soul expanding in fiendish, unholy glee, he brought his powerful hand down upon the bending German. There was a great shout of laughter. The German fell forward at length and knocked a man off the levee wall. Then the laughter changed to excited shouts. The wall was steep but not perfectly perpendicular. Several men made frantic grabs at the sliding figure. They failed, however, to catch it. Then the man turned over and rolled into the river with a great splash. Cries of horror followed his disappearance in the muddy water, and when, an instant later, his head bobbed up, yells filled the air. No one had time to help him. He tried ineffectually to reach the levee. Then the current whirled him away. The crowd caught a glimpse of a white, despairing face, which rose on the crest of a muddy wave, and then was lost. In the excitement of the moment, the colonel hurried from the spot. Horror possessed him. He felt no less than a murderer. Again he walked and walked. Retribution had overtaken him. The accursed habit that had disgraced him for 20 years had wrought its punishment. Plunged into despair, he plodded along the streets, till at length, out of his stupefaction, came the question, what would Amanda say? With that an overwhelming truth awakened him. He was free. He might have killed a man, but he certainly had killed his habit. He felt the thing dead within him. Wildly he gazed around to see where he was, and thought it a deed of fate that he had unconsciously traveled toward the home of his love. For there before his eyes was Amanda's cottage, with the red geranium in her window. He ran to the window and tapped mysteriously and peered within. Then he ran to the door and knocked. It opened with a vigorous swing. "Mr. Pepper, what do you mean? Tapping on my window in such clandestine manner, and in broad daylight, too?" demanded Miss Hill, with a stern voice none of her scholars had ever heard. "Amanda, dear, I am a murderer," cried Pepper, in tones of unmistakable joy. "I am a murderer, but I'll never do it again." "Laws!" exclaimed Miss Hill. He pushed her aside and closed the door, and got possession of her hands, all the time pouring out incoherent speech, in which only it was distinguishable. "Man alive, are you crazy?" asked Miss Hill, getting away from him into a corner. But it happened to be a corner with a couch, and when her trembling legs touched it, she sat down. "Never, never again will I do it," cried the colonel, with a grand gesture. "Can you talk sense?" faltered the schoolmistress. Colonel Pepper flung himself down beside her, and with many breathless stops and repetitions, and eloquent glances, and applications of his bandana to his heated face, he finally got his tragic story told. "Is that all?" inquired Miss Hill, with a touch of sarcasm. "Why, you're not a murderer, even if the man drowns, which isn't at all likely. You've only fallen again." "Fallen, but I never fell so terribly. This was the worst." "Stuff! Where's the chivalry you tried to make me think you were full of? Didn't you humiliate me, a poor helpless woman? Wasn't that worse? Didn't you humiliate me before a crowd of people in a candy store? Could anything be more monstrous? You did it, you remember?" "Amanda, never, never," gasped the colonel. "You did, and I let you think I believed your lies." "Amanda, I'll never do it again, never to anyone, so long as I live. It's dead, same as the card tricks. Forgive me, Amanda, and marry me. I'm so fond of you, and I'm so lonely, and those meadow lots of mine, they'll make me rich. Amanda, would you marry me? Would you love an old duffer like me? Would you like a nice little home, and an occasional silk dress, and no more teaching, and someone to love you always? Would you, Amanda? Would you?" "Yes, I would," replied Amanda. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 25. Lane was returning from a restless wandering in the woods. As he neared the flooded river, he thought he heard a shout for help. He hurried down to the bank and looked around him, but saw no living thing. Then he was brought up sharply by a cry, the unmistakable scream of a human being in distress. It seemed to come from behind a boathouse. Running as far around the building as the water would permit, he peered up and down the river in both directions. At first he saw only the half-submerged float, the sunken hull of a launch, the fast-running river, and across the wide expanse of muddy water the outline of the levee. Suddenly he spied out in the river a piece of driftwood to which a man was clinging. "Help! Help!" came faintly over the water. Lane glanced quickly about him. Several boats were pulled up on the shore, one of which evidently had been used by a boatman collecting driftwood that morning, for it contained oars and a long pike pole. The boat was long, wide of beam, and flat of bottom, with a sharp bow and a blunt stern, a craft such as experienced rivermen used for heavy work. Without a moment's hesitation, Lane shoved it into the water and sprang aboard. Meanwhile, short though the time had been, the log with its human freight had disappeared beyond the open space in the willows. Although Lane pulled a powerful stroke, when he got out of the slack water into the current, so swift was it that the boat sheered abruptly and went downstream with a sweep. Marking the piece of driftwood and aided by the swiftly running stream, Lane soon overhauled it. The log which the man appeared to be clutching was a square piece of timber, probably a beam of a bridge, for it was long and full of spikes. When near enough, Lane saw that the fellow was not holding on, but was helpless and fast on the spikes. His head and arms were above water. Lane steered the boat alongside and shouted to the man. As he made no outcry or movement, Lane, after shipping the oars, reached over and grasped his collar. Steadying himself so as not to overturn the boat, Lane pulled him halfway over the gunwale, and then with a second effort he dragged him into the boat. The man evidently had fainted after his last outcry. His body slipped off the seat and flopped to the bottom of the boat, where it lay with the white face fully exposed to the glare of the sun. A broad scar, now doubly sinister in the pallid face, disfigured the brow. Lane recoiled from the well-remembered features of Richard Swan. "God Almighty!" he cried, and his caustic laughter rolled out over the whirling waters. The boat, now disengaged from the driftwood, floated swiftly down the river. Lane stared in bewilderment at Swan's pale features. His amazement at being brought so strangely face to face with this man made him deaf to the increasing roar of the waters, and blind to the greater momentum of the boat. A heavy thump, a grating sound and splintering of wood, followed by a lurch of the boat and a splashing of cold water in his face, brought Lane back to a realization of the situation. He looked up from the white face of the unconscious man. The boat had turned round. He saw a huge stone that poked its ugly nose above the water. He turned his face downstream. A sea of irregular waves, twisting currents, dark dangerous rocks, and patches of swirling foam met his gaze. When Lane stood up, with a boatman's instinct, to see the water far ahead, the spectacle thrilled him. A yellow flood, in changeful yet consistent action, rolled and whirled down the wide incline between the stony banks, and lost itself a mile below in a smoky veil of mist. Visions of past scenes whipped in and out his mind, and he saw an ocean careening and frothing under a golden moon, a tide sweeping down, curdled with sand, a grim stream of silt, rushing on with the sullen sweep of doom and the wildfire of the prairie, leaping, cavorting, reaching out, turning and shooting, irresistibly borne under the lash of the wind. He saw in the current a live thing freeing itself in terror. A roar, like the blending of 1,000 storms among the pines, filled his ears and muffled his sense of hearing and appalled him. He sat down with his cheeks blanching, his skin tightening, his heart sinking, for in that roar he heard death. Escape was impossible. The end he had always expected was now at hand. But he was not to meet it alone. The man who had ruined his sister and so many others must go to render his accounting, and in this justice of fate Lane felt a wretched gratification. The boat glanced with a hard grind on a rock and shot down a long yellow incline. A great curling wave whirled back on Lane. A heavy shock sent him flying from his seat. A gurgling, demoniacal roar deafened his ears, and a cold, eager flood engulfed him. He was drawn under, as the whirlpool sucks a feather. He was tossed up, as the wind throws a straw. The boat bobbed upright near him. He grasped the gunwale and held on. It bounced on the buffeting waves and rode the long swells like a cork. It careened on the brink of falls and glided over them. It thumped on hidden stones and floating logs. It sped by black-nosed rocks. It drifted through fogs of yellow mist. It ran on piles of driftwood. It trembled with the shock of beating waves and twisted with the swirling current. Still Lane held on with a vice-like clutch. Suddenly he seemed to feel some mighty propelling force under him. He rose high with the stern of the boat. Then the bow pitched down into a yawning hole. A long instant he and the boat slid down a glancing fall. Then thunderous roar, furious contending wrestle, cold yellow flying spray, icy immersing enveloping blackness. A giant tore his hands from the boat. He whirled round and round as he sank. A languid softness stole over him. He saw the smile of his mother, the schoolmate of his boyhood, the old attic where he played on rainy days, and the spotted cows in the pasture and the running brook. He saw himself a tall young man, favorite of all, winning his way in life that was bright. Then terrible blows of his heart hammered at his ribs. Throbs of mighty pain burst his brain. Great constrictions of his throat choked him. He began fighting the encompassing waters with frenzied strength. Up and up he fought his way to see at last the light, to gasp at the air. But the flood sucked at him. A weight pulled at his feet. As he went down again, something hard struck him. With the last instinctive, desperate love of life in his action, he flung out his hand and grasped the saving thing. It was the boat. He hooked his elbow over the gunwale. Then darkness filmed over his eyes, and he seemed to feel himself whirling round and round, round and round. A long time, seemingly, he whirled, while the darkness before his eyes gave way to smoky light. His dead ears awoke to confused blur of sound. But the weight on his numb legs did not lessen. All at once the boat grated on a rock, and his knees struck. He lay there holding on while life and sense seemed to return. Something black and awful retreated. Then the rush and roar of the rapids was again about him. He saw that he had drifted into a back eddy behind the ledge of rock, and had whirled slowly round and round with a miscellaneous collection of driftwood. Lane steadied himself on the slippery ledge and got to his feet. The boat was half full of water, out of which Swan's ghastly face protruded. By dint of great effort, Lane pulled it sideways on the ledge and turned most of the water out. Swan lay limp and sodden. But for his eyes he would have appeared dead, and they shone with a conscious light of terror, of passionate appeal and hope, the look with which a man prayed for his life. Presently his lips moved imperceptibly. "Save me! For God's sake, save me!" Shuddering emotion that had the shock of electricity shook Lane. In his ears again rang the sullen, hollow, reverberating boom of the flood. Here was the man who had done most to harm him, begging to be saved. Swan, poor wretch, was afraid to die. He feared the unknown. He had a terror of that seething turmoil of waters. He could not face the end of that cold ride. Why? "Fool!" Lane cried, glaring wildly about him. Was it another dream? Unreality swayed him again. He heard the roar. He saw the splitting, white-crested waves, the clouds of yellow vapor. He beat his numb legs and shook himself like a savage dog. Then he made a discovery. In some way he could not account for, the oars had remained in the boat. They had been loose in their oarlocks. Questions formed in Lane's mind, questions that seemed put by a dawning significance. Why had he heard the cry for help? Why had he found the boat? Why had the drowning man proved to be one of two men on earth he hated, one of the two men whom he wanted to kill? Why had he drifted into the rapids? Why had he come safely through a vortex of death? Why had Swan's lips formed that prayer? Why had the oars remained in the boat? Far below, over the choppy sea of waves, he saw a bridge. It was his old familiar resting place. Through the white enveloping glow, he seemed to see himself standing on that bridge. Then came to him a strange revelation. Yesterday he had stood on that bridge, after seeing Blair for the last time. He had stood there while he lived through an hour of the keenest anguish that had come to him. And in that agony he had watched the plunging river. He had watched it with eyes that could never forget. His mind, exquisitely alive, with the sensibility of a plexus of racked and broken nerves, had taken up every line, every channel and stone and rapid of that flood, and had engraved them in ineffaceable characters. With the unintelligible vagary of thought, while his breast seemed crushed, his heart broken, he had imagined himself adrift on that surging river, and he had planned his escape through the rapids. As Lane stood on the ledge, knee-deep in the water, with the certainty that he had a perfect photograph of the field of tumbling waters below in his mind's eye, a strange voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "This is your great trial." Without further hesitation, he shoved the boat off the ledge. Round and round the back eddy he floated, At the outlet on the downstream side, where the gleaming line of foam marked the escape of water into the onrushing current, he whirled his boat, stern ahead. Down he shot with a plunge and then up with a rise. Racing on over the uneven swells, he felt the hissing spray, and the malignant tips of the waves that broke their fury on the boat and expended it in a shower of stinging drops. The wind cut his face. He rode a sea of foam, then turgid rolling mounds of water that heaved him up, and down long plains that laughed with hollow boom, then into channels of smooth current, where the torrent wreathed the black stones in yellowish white. Lane saw the golden sun, the blue sky, the fleecy clouds, the red and purple of the colored hills, and felt his chest expand with the mounting glory of great effort. The muscles of his back and arms, strengthened by the long toil with his heavy axe, rippled and swelled and burned, and stretched like rubber cords, and strung tight like steel bands. The boat was a toy. He rode the waves, and threaded a labyrinth of ugly stones, and shot an unobstructed channel, and evaded a menacing drift. The current carried him irresistibly onward. When his keen eye caught danger ahead, he sunk the oars deep and pulled back. A powerful stroke made the boat pause. Another turned her bow to the right or left. Then the swift water hitting her obliquely sheered her in the safe direction. So Lane kept afloat through the spray that smelled fresh and dank, through the crash and surge and roar and boom, through the boiling cauldron. The descent quickened. On he was borne with increasing velocity. The yellow demons rose in fury. Boom! Boom! The old river god voiced his remorseless roar. The shrill, screaming shriek of splitting water on sharp stones cut into the boom. On, into the yellow mist that might have been smoke from hell streaked the boat, out upon a curving billow, then down, upon an upheaving curl of frothy water. The river, like a huge yellow mound, hurled its mass at Lane. All was fog and steam and whistling spray and rumble. At length the boat swept out into the open with a long plunge over the last bit of roughened water. Here the current set in a curve to the left, running off the rocky embankment into the natural channel of the river. The dam was now only a couple of 100 yards distant. The water was smooth, and the drift had settled to a slow, ponderous, sliding movement. Lane pulled powerfully against the current and toward the right-hand shore. That was closest. Besides, he remembered a long sluice at the end of the dam where the water ran down as on a mill race. If he could row into that. In front of Lane, extending some distance, was a broad, unbroken expanse of water leading to the dam. A tremendous roar issued from that fall. The muddy spray and mist rose high. To drift over there would be fatal. Logs and pieces of debris were kept rolling there for hours before some vagary of current caught them and released them. Lane calculated the distance with cunning eye. He had been an expert boatman all his boyhood days. By the expenditure of his last bit of reserve strength, he could make the sluice. And he redoubled his efforts to such an extent that the boat scarcely went downstream at all, yet edged closer to the right-hand shore. Lane saw a crowd of people on the bridge below the dam. They were waving encouragement. He saw men run down the steep river bank below the mill, and he knew they were going to be ready to assist him if he were fortunate enough to ride down the sluice into the shallow backwater on that side. Rowing now with the most powerful of strokes, Lane kept the bow of the boat upstream and a little to the right. Thus he gained more toward the shore. But he must time the moment when it would be necessary to turn sharply. "I can make it," muttered Lane. He felt no excitement. The thing had been given him to do. His strokes were swift, but there was no hurry. Suddenly he felt a strange catching of breath in his lungs. He coughed. Blood, warm and salt, welled up from his throat. Then his bitter, strangled cry went out over the waters. At last he understood the voices of the river. Lane quickened his strokes. He swung the bow in. He pointed it shoreward. Straight for the opening of the sluice. His last strokes were prodigious. The boat swung the right way and shot into the channel. Lane dropped his oars. He saw men below wading knee-deep in the water. The boat rode the incline, down to the long swell and curled yellow billows below, where it was checked with violent shock. Lane felt himself propelled as if into darkness. When Lane opened his eyes, he recognized as through a veil the little parlor of the Idens. All about him seemed dim and far away. Faces and voices were there, indistinguishable. A dark cloud settled over his eyes. He dreamed but could not understand the dreams. The black veil came and went. What was the meaning of the numbness of his body? The immense weight upon his breast? Then it seemed he saw better, though he could not move. Sunlight streamed in at the window. Outside were maple leaves, gold and red and purple, swaying gently. Then a great roaring sound seemed to engulf him. The rapids? The voice of the river. Then Mel was there, kneeling beside him. All save her face grew vague. "Swan," he whispered. "You saved his life," said Mel. Ah, and straightway he forgot. "Mel, what's wrong with me?" Mel's face was like white marble, and her hands on his trembled violently. She could not answer, but he knew. There seemed to be a growing shadow in the room. Her eyes held a terrible darkness. "Mel, I never told you," he whispered. "I married you because I loved you. But I was jealous. I hated. I couldn't forgive. I couldn't understand. Now I know. There's a law no woman can transgress. Soul and love are the same in a woman. They must be inviolable. If I could have lived, I'd have surrendered to you. For I loved you, beyond words to tell. It was love that made me well. But we could not have been happy. Never, with that specter between us. And so it must be. Always. In spite of war and wealth, in spite of men, women must rise." His voice failed, and again the strange rush and roar enveloped him. But it seemed internal, dimmer and farther away. Mel's face was fading. She spoke, and her words were sweet, without meaning. Then the fading grayness merged into night. End of chapter 25. End of The Day of the Beast by Zane Grey.